All right, so we're back for another deep dive. And today we're looking at
Some pretty heavy stuff.
yeah, it is heavy stuff.
Yeah.
Excerpts from a text outlining some new executive orders signed by former President Trump on his return to office. And
These orders have really caused a lot of controversy, a lot of
they
discussion.
really have.
Yeah.
And we're here to break it down, like exactly what's in these orders and what could they mean.
Yeah, I think what's interesting about this is how it sort of picks up on a lot of legal and social battles that have been going on for a while now surrounding gender identity and LGBTQ plus rights.
Right.
And it seems like these orders are bringing a lot of those arguments that were sort of prominent decades ago back into the forefront in this new political climate.
Yeah, so let's get into like the foundation of these orders.
Okay.
The text highlights a very specific definition of what sex is.
Yeah.
It's purely biological, based on reproductive anatomy,
Right.
and it really stresses that it only recognizes male and female. And it goes on to explicitly say it doesn't recognize any gender identities.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, what are some of the immediate implications of having that definition just like right out of the gate?
Well, I think it's important to remember that this definition isn't just symbolic, right? It actually has the potential to really impact a lot of different things, like federal policies, practices, documents, access to different facilities, even things like how prisons are structured.
Right.
And so the text mentions that prisons would be segregated based on this very strict biological definition of sex, which, as you can imagine,
Yeah,
raises a lot of concern.
it does.
Yeah.
So what are some of those concerns? Like what are some of the risks of having that kind of policy in place when we think about the prison system and transgender individuals?
Well, I think one of the biggest things is that there is a ton of research showing that transgender individuals already face a lot of vulnerabilities in prisons.
Right.
And so by putting transgender individuals in facilities based on their sex assigned at birth instead of their gender identity really opens them up to a lot of increased risks. We're talking about things like harassment and violence, and also, inadequate health care.
Right.
And it's interesting because the text itself doesn't really address these potential consequences.
Yeah.
But I think it's really a crucial part of this whole discussion.
It is. It is.
Yeah.
And speaking of healthcare access, that's another major thing that came up in the text. And specifically, it talked about gender-affirming care.
Right.
And the order goes so far as to eliminate federal funding for that type of
Right.
care.
Mm-hmm.
And it frames that decision as like a matter of fiscal responsibility.
Right.
But what does that actually mean for people who rely on these services? Like, what are the alternatives?
Yeah, that's a really important point. And I think the main takeaway is that for a lot of transgender individuals, gender affirming care isn't just like elective. It's really essential medical treatment that can have a huge impact on their mental and physical well-being.
Right.
And so cutting off that federal funding could make it really, really hard for people to get that care.
Right.
And it could put people in a really difficult position where they have to choose between financial hardship and their health.
Yeah.
And what's really interesting is that the text doesn't really go into any detail about alternative funding sources or what it could mean for healthcare providers who, offer this care.
Right.
So while it might make sense from like a purely budgetary perspective, it has a lot of real world consequences that I think need to be considered.
Yeah, it really sounds like that part of the order has like a ripple effect that goes way beyond just like the immediate budget stuff.
Right. Yeah.
So moving on a little bit, the text also talks about restrictions on the use of pronouns in government settings. And it specifically blocks any requirements for people to use specific pronouns.
Yeah.
And it cites the First Amendment as justification for that. So what are the legal arguments at play here?
Well, I think this part of the order really gets into the weeds of this intersection between freedom of speech and discrimination and the rights of transgender individuals to be recognized the way they identify.
Right.
So people who are against these pronoun requirements argue that it violates their right to free speech to be forced to use certain pronouns.
Right.
But on the other side, people argue that refusing to acknowledge someone's preferred pronouns is actually a form of discrimination and harassment. And so the text really leans on the free speech argument.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to see this within the context of all these other debates that are going on about these issues legally.
Right. And it sounds like that this is going to be a big area for legal challenges in the future.
Yeah, I think so.
And it doesn't stop there.
No.
The text goes on to outline a second executive order that targets diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, or DEI programs. So can you give us a little bit of background on what these programs are and why they're being targeted?
Yeah, so DEI programs, they really encompass a lot of different initiatives
Okay.
that are designed to promote representation and equal opportunities for groups that have historically been marginalized. And this can include things like recruitment and hiring practices,
Right.
educational curriculum, workplace training, really a whole bunch of stuff.
Right.
And so critics of these programs argue that they're promoting divisive concepts and that they're giving priority to certain groups over others,
Right.
and that this is actually creating reverse discrimination.
Okay.
So the text really echoes a lot of these criticisms, and it frames eliminating federal funding for DEI as a way to restore fairness and meritocracy.
So putting this all back into the bigger picture, it seems like these actions are part of a larger conservative movement that wants to roll back what they see as going too far with gender ideology and LGBTQ plus rights.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. There's definitely a segment of the population that feels like that push for LGBTQ plus inclusion has sort of gone too far, that it's infringing on things like religious freedoms and traditional values. And they view these orders as like a necessary correction to get back to what they see as a more balanced approach to social policy.
Okay.
And the text definitely reflects that perspective.
Right.
But it's super important to remember that there's a lot of opposition to this viewpoint.
Yeah, the text did say that there was like a strong backlash from civil rights groups.
Right.
So what does that look like? Like what forms is that backlash taking?
Well, we're already seeing a lot of legal challenges coming from groups like the ACLU and Lambda Legal,
Right.
who are saying that these orders violate constitutional rights and principles of equality.
Okay.
And we're also seeing protests and demonstrations happening all over. And they're really trying to draw attention to the potential harm that these orders could cause. So it's pretty clear that this issue isn't going away anytime soon, and it's probably going to continue to be a source of a lot of debate and activism.
Yeah, it definitely seems like we're at the very beginning of what could be a really long and complicated legal and social battle.
Yeah, I think so.
So just to kind of sum up everything we've talked about, we have these executive orders that redefine, sex restrict, access to health care could potentially impact the safety of transgender people in prisons, limit the use of pronouns, and defund diversity programs.
Yeah.
It's a lot to unpack.
It is a lot.
And it's clear that the implications are really big.
Yeah, and I think it all comes back to this really fundamental question of how do we define and protect individual rights while also navigating all this complexity around gender identity in a society that's constantly changing.
Right.
So I really want you to think about how these orders might not only impact those who are directly affected by them, but how they might impact our broader social fabric as a nation. What questions does this all raise for you about the future of gender identity and LGBTQ plus rights in the U.S.?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
We'll have to leave it there for today. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
And we'll see you next time.
See you later.